The mahogany table smelled like polish and old victories as I sat across from Richard Carter. His cufflinks caught the light like tiny verdicts. Veronica Hale slid the stack of divorce papers toward me with a patient smile. My name looked small on every page. Veronica's voice kept politely low. The way people sound when they think mercy is paperwork. She said the settlement was simple. Richard would keep the house, the company, and the life that photographed well from the sidewalk. She listed Max and Daisy as corporate assets, as if Heartbeat were inventory. I kept breathing because it was the only thing left I owned. The room hummed with the confidence of people who believed the ending was filed. Richard's posture announced power, while his eyes rehearsed celebration. I placed my fingertips on the signature line and felt the paper resist like gritted teeth. They called it closure while prying loose the last hinge of my dignity. Veronica narrated numbers, reducing decades into tidy columns. Richard adjusted his gold watch, a metronome counting down my usefulness. I thought of the front porch I painted twice by hand and the roses that outlived winters. Max slept by the bedroom door whenever fever pinned me. Daisy followed me through the garden like a sunbeam with paws. Veronica itemized their food and vet bills to prove possession. I memorized her cadence for later. Each word a pin I would pull when the quiet stopped being useful. Richard leaned back, pleased by the symmetry of his victory. He said adults accept change and hinted I should be grateful this wasn't uglier. I remembered payroll nights when I covered gaps with personal savings so our crews were paid. He remembered golf tournaments, handshakes, and the easy myth of deserving. I lifted the pen because humiliation is a tool when you know how to hold it. Ink moved, and the room relaxed. Veronica gathered the pages like a dealer raking chips. A clerk witnessed my consent to disappear, stamping it neat so no one had to raise a voice. I did not argue for the house or make a case for history. I did not beg for the dogs. Though the silence tasted like metal, I let them believe they had finished me. Because belief can be a leash. I left my ring on the table and walked out steady as early winter. Alone. The Motel 6 on the edge of town smelled like bleach and burned coffee. The carpet was thin enough to remember other people's footsteps. I set my single suitcase on the bedspread, patterned with faded seashells, and listened to the hum of a vending machine outside my door. The silence pressed against me, thick and unkind. Through the cracked blinds, headlights traced across the wall, breaking the dark into brief slices of movement. Somewhere across town, Richard and Veronica were likely unpacking their clothes into the drawers I had lined with cedar paper. My name was still on the deed that no longer belonged to me. Humiliation has an aftertaste that clings longer than whiskey. The television flickered static when I tried to drown the thoughts. I counted the remaining cash in my purse, $800 and a few coins. It was a number that made time feel small. Even the dogs were gone, sleeping in my bed under someone else's hand. I sat on the edge of the bed, phone in hand, staring at a number I hadn't dialed in 2 years. Joyce answered on the second ring, her voice half asleep but warm. When I told her Richard had left and taken everything, there was a silence that felt like grief breaking open. She said she was booking a flight. No discussion needed. Pack your bag. She told me, "You're coming to Florida tonight." For the first time in months, I let myself believe escape could still mean beginning. Florida felt like another planet compared to Connecticut. The air was heavier, fragrant with salt and gardenias, and Joyce's house hummed with the easy rhythm of a life that hadn't been broken open. She made coffee and filled the silence with stories about neighbors and cats. Pretending we weren't both trying to patch over the years we'd lost, I slept in her guest room, surrounded by lavender walls and the smell of detergent that somehow felt like safety. On the 5th morning, Joyce walked in holding a thick yellow envelope. She said it came from sorting through Grandpa Henry's old desk, something she'd been meaning to do. My name was written on the front in his steady cursive. Inside were an old bank card key, a short note, and a line that read, "For Evelyn, Farmers Bank. Account 42398. Started this for you when you were born." I stared at the note until the words blurred. Henry had been a man of few promises, but the ones he made were iron. Joyce shrugged and said the account probably held $50. A relic more sentimental than useful. Still, she drove me downtown to the little brick bank squeezed between a bakery and a tailor. The place smelled of dust and polish, a time capsule of paper ledgers and whispered transactions. The teller typed the number twice, then called a supervisor. Their faces shifted from politeness to disbelief. The man turned the screen toward me, his voice careful. The account, untouched except for monthly interest, held $872,000. My knees nearly gave out. Grandpa Henry had planted a seed 60 years ago and let time water it quietly into fortune. Outside the bank, sunlight poured through the palm leaves in golden threads. My hands trembled as I held the paperwork, feeling both awe and the sudden pulse of possibility. Across the street, a newspaper rack displayed a glossy magazine cover, Richard and Veronica, smiling beneath the headline, "Power Couple of the Year." I looked at their perfect photograph and almost laughed. Grandpa hadn't just left me money, had left me ammunition. The morning after the bank visit, I sat at Joyce's kitchen table staring at the check like it might vanish if I blinked too long. $872,000. It felt both unreal and perfectly timed, as if Grandpa Henry had written me a message through compound interest. Joyce watched me with cautious pride, the kind that waits for grief to finish before hope steps forward. That afternoon, I called Thomas Reed, an old family acquaintance and the only attorney I still trusted. We hadn't spoken in years, but he remembered me instantly and listened without interruption as I told him what Richard had done. When I mentioned the inheritance, his tone sharpened. He said wealth was only useful if it came with strategy. And I told him strategy was exactly what I had in mind. 2 days later, I met Thomas at his Hartford office. He looked older, silver hair, neat, eyes still quick behind his glasses. I told him I wanted to invest not in a house or stocks, but in power. Together, we drafted the framework for the Aurora Trust, an anonymous investment entity with me as the sole beneficiary. Its mission was simple: to quietly buy back the empire I had built, but never owned. The next week unfolded like a lesson in patience. Wire transfers crossed state lines. Signatures multiplied, and shell companies bloomed like chess pieces across the board. By the time the paperwork settled, Aurora Trust had purchased nearly 24% of Carter & Sons through discreet channels. My fingerprints were nowhere on the documents, but my intent was carved into every transaction. Thomas warned that Richard might never forgive me if he discovered the truth. I told him forgiveness was not part of the investment plan. In the evenings, I sat on Joyce's porch, listening to Florida cicadas buzz like ticking clocks. Every sound felt like a countdown to something inevitable. Richard had always believed I didn't understand the business. Soon, he would learn that I understood it better than anyone, and this time, I'd bought my seat at the table. The October sky over Hartford was sharp and cold, the kind that made everything look more defined. I arrived at Carter & Sons headquarters 10 minutes early, dressed in a navy suit that carried no apology. The receptionist checked her list twice when I introduced myself as the representative of Aurora Trust. Her nervousness amused me. No one expects a 63-year-old woman with polite manners to bring a storm. The boardroom was exactly as I remembered it: a long walnut table, a skyline view, and the faint scent of ambition. Richard sat at the head, surrounded by 7 board members, and, of course, Veronica Hale at his right. She wore the kind of smile that comes from believing you've already won. I took my seat near the middle and placed a leather folder in front of me. When Richard finally looked up and recognized me, his confidence cracked like glass under pressure. His greeting came slow, each word wrapped in disbelief. I introduced myself calmly as Ms. Wan, Evelyn Carter, representing Aurora Trust, which now held 23.7% of the company. The room went still. It was the kind of silence that falls when people realize a story they thought ended has just begun. Veronica blinked hard, her fingers twitching toward her tablet. Richard's jaw tightened, his eyes searching for any hint that this might be a mistake. I explained that Aurora Trust had legally acquired its shares through multiple authorized channels, all within disclosure limits. The board members looked between us, waiting to see who would speak first. Richard finally broke the silence, asking what I wanted. I told him I wanted transparency about company expenses, about executive compensation, and about misuse of corporate resources. I mentioned the New Hamptons property, purchased under the company name but used privately. I spoke of the luxury corporate retreat and the wardrobe allowance for legal counsel. I let the details hang in the air, quiet but heavy. Veronica tried to interrupt, citing confidentiality and procedure. I thanked her for her concern and reminded her that as corporate counsel, her fees were also subject to review. She went pale, and I watched her fight the urge to check her phone again. Richard turned red, his composure slipping beneath a mask of irritation. He muttered something about vindictive ex-wives. Forgetting that I was no longer an ex-wife in this room, I was a shareholder. Then I brought up Max and Daisy. I referred to them by their official classification, corporate assets. I suggested revisiting the company's policy on living assets to ensure they were placed in an appropriate environment. The board shifted uncomfortably, while Richard's expression hardened into fury. I smiled, just slightly, because humiliation looks different when it's wearing a suit. He demanded we discuss the matter privately, but I declined. Business, I told him, should be handled transparently. The board members nodded, intrigued, perhaps entertained. Veronica whispered something to him. Likely damage control. But the room had already turned. Power, once lost, doesn't announce its departure, it simply changes seats. When the meeting adjourned, I stood and gathered my folder, my pulse steady. Richard's glare followed me out, a mix of disbelief and fear. The hallway outside the boardroom was bright with morning light, and for the first time in months, I felt tall again. The war had officially begun, and I'd just fired the opening shot. Richard Carter didn't waste time pretending civility after that meeting. Within days, I noticed the same car parked outside my apartment, its engine running long after dark. He had hired someone to watch me, to remind me that he still knew how to intimidate. The sight of those headlights through the blinds became my nightly alarm clock. But fear wasn't new to me, it just had a different shape now. I started keeping meticulous notes, documenting everything from suspicious phone calls to unfamiliar faces at the grocery store. Thomas Reed assured me that surveillance was a desperate man's habit, not a strategy. He said Richard would strike next through paperwork, not shadows. He was right. 2 weeks later, Carter and Sons lawyers filed motions to contest the legitimacy of Aurora Trust shares. They claimed I'd manipulated financial disclosures and violated insider trading rules. The accusations were loud but empty, and Thomas dismantled them with surgical precision. Still, Richard's arrogance had cracked, and through those cracks, the truth began to leak. When the financial statements arrived, I combed through every line like a detective with a personal vendetta. It didn't take long to find the rot. Richard had used company funds to purchase a $2 million property in Martha's Vineyard. Disguised as a corporate retreat, he had approved luxury vehicles for executive development. All traced back to Veronica Hale. Even their therapy sessions were billed as strategic leadership counseling. I forwarded everything to Thomas. His voice over the phone carried a mix of disbelief and satisfaction. He told me we now had grounds to initiate a board-led investigation into executive misconduct. For the first time, the scales were tipping in my favor. And it wasn't emotion, it was math, paper, and proof. I called for an emergency board meeting, armed with documents, photographs, and a calm I hadn't felt in years. As I presented the numbers, the faces around the table shifted from curiosity to shock. Richard tried to shout over me, calling it personal revenge, but the evidence spoke louder than I ever could. By the time I finished, the board voted 5-2 in favor of a full audit. When I walked out of that room, Richard's voice followed me, low and furious. He said I'd regret this, that I'd gone too far. I didn't bother turning around. He still thought this was about revenge. It wasn't. It was about exposure, and exposure always burns the one hiding the longest. Veronica Hale showed up at my apartment on a Thursday night, long after the sun had burned out over Hartford. Her usual confidence was gone, replaced by trembling hands and a face pale from too little sleep. She looked smaller without her courtroom armor. The woman who once held my future between her fingers, now clutching her purse like a lifeline. I opened the door because I wanted to see what fear looked like on her. She didn't bother with pleasantries. Her voice cracked as she told me the State Bar Association was investigating her for billing irregularities. The same patterns I had exposed to the board were now crawling through her own practice like termites. She admitted to using company funds to pay off personal debts, credit cards, her mortgage, even her daughter's tuition. Every transaction, she said, had been approved by Richard. I poured her coffee, not out of kindness, but curiosity. Veronica confessed that Richard had already hired a new attorney and was preparing to let her take the fall. His plan was to claim ignorance, to make her the scapegoat for the fraud I had uncovered. She said he'd promised to protect her, then handed her silence over to the wolves. For the first time, I believed she understood what betrayal really felt like. When she finally asked for my help, her voice broke completely. She offered full cooperation documents, passwords, emails in exchange for legal protection. I told her I didn't make deals out of pity, but I did make them out of purpose. By the time she left, I had everything I needed to destroy Richard Carter's empire from the inside. The irony wasn't lost on me that the woman who stole my marriage had just handed me the weapon to end my husband's reign. The December board meeting felt more like a trial than a corporate gathering. The room was full, the air tight with anticipation, and every eye followed me as I entered with Thomas Reed and Veronica Hale by my side. I carried 3 boxes of documents, the kind that could make or break reputations. Richard Carter sat at the head of the table, trying to look unbothered, but the sweat at his temples betrayed him. When the meeting opened, I spoke first. My tone was calm, deliberate, the way you speak when truth no longer needs performance. I presented evidence of the offshore accounts, the contractor kickbacks, and the false insurance claims connected to the Martha's Vineyard property. Each file I opened was another nail in the coffin Richard had built for himself, thinking no one would ever see inside. The board members leaned forward, silent except for the soft click of pens. Richard's lawyer objected, claiming the accusations were exaggerated. I reminded her that the numbers came from his own records. Then I revealed the final piece, Richard's secret plan to sell Carter and Sons to Pinnacle Investment Group, a shell company he secretly controlled. in order to cash out and vanish. The words hit the room like shrapnel. David Ross demanded an explanation. Maria Santos whispered fraud under her breath. And even Veronica, seated beside me, kept her eyes fixed on the table. Richard tried to shout over the noise, insisting he was within his rights. But no one was listening anymore. The vote of no confidence passed 6-1, leaving him alone in the wreckage of his own arrogance. Thomas nominated me as interim CEO, and the motion carried without debate. As the gavel struck, I caught Richard's glare, pure hatred mixed with disbelief. I told him quietly that this wasn't revenge. It was accountability. He had taken everything from me once. But this time, I had taken everything back with interest. 6 months later, Carter and Sons looked nothing like the company Richard had run. The numbers told their own redemption story: profits up 23%. Waste reduced to almost nothing. Once the smoke cleared, the Securities and Exchange Commission issued its findings. Richard Carter paid $3 million in fines and accepted a lifetime ban from serving as a corporate officer. Veronica Hale avoided prison by cooperating fully with investigators. Her law license was gone. Her reputation dismantled. But she had learned a lesson that courtrooms couldn't teach. The Martha's Vineyard property was sold, and the proceeds returned to company accounts. Every cent Richard had stolen now worked to rebuild what he'd once tried to destroy. For me, justice didn't arrive with a gavel. It came quietly. In balance sheets and calm mornings, Max and Daisy were back at my side. Now, the unofficial mascots of the company. They followed me into the office each day, their paws echoing on marble floors, tails wagging as employees stopped to greet them. I often thought of Grandpa Henry and his $50 seed. What he planted had become more than fortune. It had become proof that patience, when paired with resolve, could grow into justice. The evening air in Hartford felt softer than it used to. As if the city had exhaled after a long storm, I hosted a small dinner in my apartment. Joyce, Thomas, and David around my table. Laughter replacing the silence that once filled my nights. The wine was modest, the food simple, but it tasted like freedom. For the first time, I wasn't rebuilding, I was simply living. When dessert came, I told them my decision. I would step down as CEO next month and move into the role of chairwoman. The company no longer needed me to fight, it needed new energy to grow. Thomas looked surprised. Joyce smiled through tears. And David raised his glass, understanding before I said the words. I told them about Frank Miller, the bank supervisor who'd helped me uncover Grandpa Henry's account. We'd been seeing each other quietly, sharing coffee, stories, and the comfort of people who know loss but still choose joy. Joyce teased that I'd finally found someone who didn't need saving. I told her maybe this time I'd found someone who could walk beside me instead. Later that night, I took Max and Daisy for a walk under the streetlights. Their tails swayed in rhythm, steady and sure. I thought about everything I'd lost and everything I'd reclaimed. Justice had done its work. What remained was peace. Thank you for watching till the end. If this story moved you, hit subscribe. Share it with someone who still believes kindness can't be broken, and tell me where you're watching from. Your voice keeps our stories alive.